The transport ship landed on Veltharis Prime with a deep rumble that shook the dust off the platform. And out of the hatch stepped the least impressive warrior the galaxy had ever sent to the combat trials. His name was Kale Morrow, and he was human. That alone was enough to make every alien on the landing pad stop and stare, because humans were new to the Galactic Concord, and nobody really took them seriously. Not yet. Not ever if most species had their way about it. Kale stood about 6 feet tall, which on Earth would have made him a decent-sized man. But here on Veltharis Prime, he looked like a child standing among giants, because the Thyari warriors waiting at the gate were 7 and 8 feet tall, with scales that shimmered like polished metal, and eyes that burned like hot coals in their long, sharp faces. He carried one bag over his shoulder, and wore a simple gray uniform, with no medals and no decorations, just a name patch stitched above his chest. Pocket, and he walked with the slow, steady pace of a man who was in no hurry to impress anyone. A Gorvon cadet standing near the entrance looked down at him and let out a low rumbling sound that passed for a laugh among their kind. And the Gorvon was built like a tank, covered in natural bone armor that made him look like a walking fortress. Easily 400 pounds of muscle and plate. "They sent one human," the Gorvon said to his companion, a four-armed Zelkari, who was twirling a practice knife between each set of fingers like it was a nervous habit. "Just one." "Maybe the others were too afraid," the Zelkari answered, and they both laughed again as Kale walked past them without looking up. The academy was enormous, a sprawling complex of training arenas and barracks and weapons halls built into the side of a red mountain, and it had stood for over 600 years as the place where the greatest warriors of every species came to prove themselves in interspecies combat trials. Every species except humans until now. Kale followed the signs to the main arena where the opening ceremony was being held, and when he walked through the massive doors, he found himself standing at the edge of a coliseum that could seat 10,000, with a sand-covered fighting floor in the center, and rows upon rows of seats filled with cadets and officers from a dozen different worlds. He found his assigned spot at the far end of the lowest row, right next to a Prelian who was so old his shell had turned white. And the old alien looked at Kale with cloudy eyes and gave him a nod that might have been respect or might have been pity. The ceremony began with speeches from the Academy Commandant, a Thyari general with so many scars on his face that his scales looked like a shattered mirror. And he spoke about honor and tradition and the glory of combat. And Kale listened quietly with his hands resting on his knees. Then came the "All cadets will now receive their standard-issue Concord training blades," the Commandant announced. And a line of servitor drones floated out from the armory, carrying racks of gleaming swords. The blades were beautiful. Kale had to admit that much. Forged from Veltharian crystal steel that caught the light and threw it back in pale blue flashes, and each one was perfectly balanced, with a wrapped grip and a guard shaped like a curved wing. Each blade weighed exactly 4.2 kilograms, which was about 9 pounds in Earth measurement, and they were considered the ideal weight for a standard galactic warrior. Heavy enough to do damage, but light enough for speed and technique. One by one, the cadets stepped forward and took their blades, and each one gave a few test swings to feel the balance. The arena filled with the sound of crystal steel cutting through air as dozens of warriors from dozens of species practiced their forms. Kale's turn came. He stepped forward and lifted the blade off the rack with one hand. He held it up in front of his face and looked at it the way a person might look at a utensil they did not recognize, turning it slowly left and then right, and then he gave it one experimental swing. The blade moved through the air so fast it whistled, and a few nearby cadets stepped back in surprise. But Kale did not look impressed. He frowned. He set the blade back down on the rack and looked at the servitor drone hovering beside him. "Is there something heavier?" he asked. The arena did not go silent all at once. It was more like a wave, the quiet spreading outward from where Kale stood as more and more people heard what he had said and turned to look. Within 10 seconds, every eye in the Colosseum was on the human who had just asked for a heavier sword. That was when Commander Silith Vayant stepped forward. She was the Academy's most decorated blade instructor, a Thyari female who stood exactly 7 feet tall, with scales the color of dark emerald and eyes like molten gold. And she moved with the kind of liquid grace that only came from a lifetime of combat training, every step precise and every motion controlled. She stopped in front of Kale and looked down at him, with her arms crossed over her chest and a thin smile on her lips that showed just the tips of her fangs. "Did I hear you correctly, human?" she asked, and her voice carried across the silent arena like a blade itself, sharp and cold. "I asked if there was something heavier," Kale repeated, and his voice was calm and flat and completely unaware of or unconcerned with the fact that he was speaking to the most dangerous person on the planet. Silith stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a gentle laugh. It was a full, open, ringing laugh that bounced off the arena walls and filled the entire Colosseum. And within seconds, half the cadets were laughing too, the Gorvon rumbling, and the Zelkari clicking, and the Thyari hissing their amusement, because the idea of a human asking for a heavier blade was the funniest thing any of them had heard in years. "That blade has felled Gorvon champions," Silith said when she could speak again, wiping a tear from one golden eye with a clawed finger. "Perhaps you should worry less about the weight and more about whether you can swing it at all." More laughter, louder this time. Kale did not smile, and he did not frown, and he did not react at all. He just looked at the crystal steel blade on the rack with an expression that someone who knew him well might have recognized as disappointment, the same way a carpenter might look at a hammer made of foam. He turned and walked off the sparring floor without another word, and the laughter followed him all the way to the exit. That night in the officers' quarters, Silith pulled up the personnel file for the human representative on her datapad, expecting to find the record of some politician's son or some token soldier sent to make humanity feel included. Most of the file was redacted, blocked behind security clearances she did not have access to, which was unusual for a simple combat cadet, and the sections she could read were sparse and unhelpful. But at the very bottom of the file, in small plain text, there was one line that was not redacted. "Survived 14 months solo deployment, Kepler 442b, gravity 3.1 times Earth standard." Silith did not know what that meant, not yet. She closed the datapad and went to sleep, and she did not think about the human again until the morning, when the quartermaster came to her office with a weapons requisition form and a look on his face like he had seen a ghost. "Commander," Old Duke said, holding out the form with trembling hands, "you need to see what the human just ordered." Silith took the requisition form from Duke's trembling hands and read it twice because the first time she was certain her translator had glitched. "A training blade forged from compressed tungsten carbide alloy," she read aloud, and then she got to the number at the bottom and stopped. 38 kilograms. Duke nodded, and his old shell creaked as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I ran it through the system 3 times, Commander, thinking it was an error. But the human confirmed it himself this morning, walked right into my office, and said he needed a blade that weighs 38 kilograms, and could I please have it ready within the week." 38 kilograms was 84 pounds in Earth measurement, and to put that in perspective, the heaviest ceremonial greatsword in the Thyari military weighed 12 kilograms and required 2 hands and a lifetime of training to wield effectively. Silith set the form down on her desk, looked at the old quartermaster. "Fill the order," she said. Duck blinked all 4 of his cloudy eyes at once. "Commander, with respect, the human will hurt himself. That weight is—" "Fill it," Silith repeated, and there was something in her voice that was not quite curiosity and not quite concern, but somewhere in between. "And notify me when it arrives." Over the next several days, the early sparring rounds of the combat trials began, and they proceeded exactly as everyone expected, which meant the humans were not involved at all. The Thyari cadets moved through their matches like dancers made of razors, their twin-blade style a thing of terrible beauty that combined speed and precision in ways that left their opponents bleeding before they even knew they had been cut. The Gorvon were the opposite, slow and crushing and inevitable, their bone-plated bodies absorbing hits that would have broken anyone else while they swung their massive clubs. Hammers with enough force to crack the arena floor. The Zelkari were perhaps the most impressive to watch, their 4 arms, each wielding a separate blade in perfect coordination, creating a wall of flashing steel that seemed impossible to penetrate from any angle. And Kale Morrow, the sole human representative, was in remedial training. Silith had assigned him there herself, after he refused to spar with the standard blade. And remedial training was where they sent cadets who were not ready for real competition. A small practice room with padded walls and training dummies, and the faint smell of shame. But Kale did not seem to mind. He spent his mornings in the remedial room, doing footwork drills with no weapon at all, just moving back and forth across the floor in patterns that seemed random at first, but revealed themselves over time to be something much more deliberate. Something practiced and refined over years until it was carved into his muscles like writing carved into stone. In the afternoons, he went to the gravity gym. The Academy's gravity training facility could simulate up to 2 times the standard galactic gravity, which was considered extreme and was only used by advanced cadets preparing for deployment on heavy worlds. And most species could barely function at that level, their joints aching and their lungs straining under the invisible weight. Kale had submitted a request to push the system to 3 times standard. The technicians thought he was joking, but when he insisted, they made the modifications. And then they watched through the observation window as the human walked into the chamber, and the gravity tripled, and he barely changed his posture at all. He moved a little slower, that was true, and his breathing deepened, but he did not stumble, and he did not strain, and he certainly did not collapse the way most species would have. And then he started doing his footwork drills again. Patterns from the morning, except now each step cracked the reinforced flooring beneath his feet because 38 kilograms of additional force was pressing down on every part of his body, and his legs were pushing back against all of it without complaint. Silith watched the surveillance feed from her office that evening, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt uncertain. She pulled up the Concord Xenobiology database and searched for humans, and what she found kept her reading long past midnight. Humans were from Earth, a world with a gravity of 1 g, which most galactic species already found oppressive and uncomfortable. But that was just the beginning of what made them strange. They were persistence predators, the database explained, which meant that millions of years ago, before they had tools or weapons or fire, they hunted by chasing their prey until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, and move for hours and hours without stopping, in a way that almost no other species in the galaxy could match. They cooled themselves by sweating, which was a bizarre and inefficient-sounding system that turned out to be devastatingly effective, allowing them to regulate their body temperature during sustained exertion, while every other predator on their planet had to stop and pant and rest. Their bones healed when broken, which was common enough, but human bones healed stronger at the breakpoint, as if the body was learning from its injuries and reinforcing itself against future damage. And then there was the adrenaline response. The database called it a temporary neurochemical combat state and described it in clinical terms, but what it meant in plain language was that when a human was frightened or angry or fighting for survival, their body flooded itself with chemicals that temporarily increased strength and speed and pain tolerance to levels that the Concord scientists had classified as, and Silith read this word 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly, anomalous. Other species had similar stress responses, but none of them were as dramatic or as sustained as what humans could produce. And the scientists had noted with some alarm that humans could maintain this state for extended periods without the catastrophic organ failure that other species experienced. Silith closed the database and sat in the dark for a while, thinking. Then she pulled up Kale's file again and looked at that one unredacted line. 14 months, solo, on a world with 3.1 times Earth's gravity. Earth was already a heavy world by galactic standards, a place that bred dense bones and thick muscles, and a cardiovascular system that could sustain effort for hours. And Kale had spent over a year on a world that made Earth feel like a vacation, alone, with no support and no extraction, and whatever had happened there was classified at a level that even a commander could not access. She was beginning to understand why he thought the crystal steel blade was too light. On Veltharis Prime, which had a comfortable gravity of 0.7 g, a man conditioned to function under 3 times Earth's gravity would feel like he was walking on a cloud, like everything around him was made of paper and air and nothing, like he could jump twice his own height and punch through a wall without trying. The standard blade did not feel light to Kale because he was arrogant. It felt light because to him, it genuinely was. The custom blade arrived 6 days later, and Duke brought it to the training hall himself because no servitor drone could carry it safely. And even with a cargo drone assisting him, the old quartermaster was struggling under the weight, his shell scraping against the floor as he shuffled forward with the massive weapon laid across a reinforced carrying rack. It was not a pretty weapon, not like the crystal steel blades with their blue shimmer and elegant curves. It was a brutal slab of dark gray metal with a straight edge and a square guard and a grip wrapped in simple black cord, and it looked less like a sword and more like someone had sharpened a girder. Kale was waiting in the training hall, and when Duck arrived with the blade he walked over and looked at it for a moment with the first expression anyone at the academy had ever seen on his face that was not completely flat. He looked pleased. He reached down and picked it up with one hand, lifting 38 kilograms of tungsten carbide off the rack the way a normal person might pick up a tennis racket, and he gave it a single swing that displayed so much air it ruffled Duck's shell plates from 3 meters away. Then he gave it a second swing, faster, and the sound it made cutting through the air was not a whistle like the crystal steel blades made, but a deep thrumming hum that you could feel in your chest like a second heartbeat. Kale nodded once. Better, he said. Duke looked at the human holding the impossible sword in one hand like it was nothing, and then he looked at the cracks in the floor where Kale's feet had shifted during the swing. And then he looked back at the human's calm, unremarkable face. Ancestors preserve me, the old quartermaster whispered to himself as he shuffled out of the training hall. The ranked sparring rounds began on the 14th day of the trials, and the arena was packed to its full capacity of 10,000 for the first time since a Gorvan champion had killed a Thyari prince in the ring 6 years ago. But this time nobody had come to see royalty fight. They had come to see the human. Word had spread through the academy the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast and impossible to stop. And the story had grown with each telling until it was barely recognizable. Some said the human had ordered a blade that weighed 50 kilograms. Others said 100. One particularly creative Zelkari cadet claimed the human had carved his own sword from the bones of a creature he had killed with his bare hands on some death world. The truth was strange enough without the exaggeration, but the galaxy had never been good at restraint when it came to stories. Kale's first opponent was a Zelkari four-blade specialist named Rhett Kavo, and Rhett was everything Kale was not. tall and lean and flashy with bright orange skin and a mouth that never stopped moving. And he had won his last 8 matches by overwhelming his opponents with speed and showmanship in equal measure. The betting odds were 40-1 against the human. Kale walked onto the arena floor, carrying the tungsten blade over his right shoulder, the way a lumberjack might carry an axe. And the crowd murmured when they saw it, because even from the upper seats you could tell this was not a normal weapon. It was too dark and too thick, and it moved through the air with a weight that you could almost hear. Rhett was already in the ring, spinning his 4 crystal steel blades in a complex pattern that created a cage of flashing light around his body. And when he saw Kale approach, he grinned with all 3 rows of teeth. "I was hoping they would match me against you, little human," Rhett said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I wanted to be the one to send you home." Kale did not answer. He just planted his feet shoulder-width apart and let the tungsten blade rest on his shoulder, and waited. The starting tone sounded. Rhett exploded forward like a coiled spring releasing, all 4 arms moving independently in a pattern that created overlapping arcs of crystal steel coming from 4 different angles simultaneously. And it was genuinely beautiful to watch, a display of coordination and speed that had earned him the nickname the Storm among his fellow cadets. Kale did not move. Rhett closed the distance in under a second and launched his opening combination. A high slash from the upper right, a thrust from the lower left, a sweeping cut from behind aimed at the legs, and a downward chop from directly overhead. 4 attacks arriving within a fraction of a second of each other from 4 different directions. Kale made one move. He stepped forward and swung the tungsten blade in a single lateral arc, from right to left, not fast by his standards, but so fast that the crowd barely saw it, and the displacement of air from the swing hit Rhett like a physical wall half a second before the blade itself arrived. 2 of Rhett's 4 swords shattered on contact with the tungsten edge, the crystal steel breaking apart like glass hitting concrete, and the shockwave of the impact sent the Zelkari stumbling backward 3 full steps with his remaining 2 blades crossed in front of his body in a desperate guard. The arena went completely silent. Rhett looked down at the broken stumps of his 2 destroyed swords, the crystal steel handles still in his hands with jagged edges where the blades used to be. And then he looked up at Kale, who had already returned to his starting position with the tungsten blade resting on his shoulder again. His expression unchanged, his breathing unchanged, everything about him exactly the same as it had been before the exchange. Said, and his voice was very quiet. The silence held for another 3 seconds, and then the arena erupted. Not in cheers exactly, but in something more complicated, a sound that was part shock and part fear, and part the very beginning of something that might eventually become respect. Kale walked off the floor without looking at the crowd. His second match was against a fiery blade dancer named Vela, who was fast enough to leave afterimages in the air when she moved, and she lasted longer than Rhett by about 30 seconds because she was smart enough not to engage the tungsten blade directly, instead darting in and out at angles, trying to find an opening in Kale's guard. She never found one. Kale moved the massive blade with a control that should not have been possible, shifting it from shoulder to guard to sweep to block, with movements that were not graceful but were absolutely precise. Every motion exactly as large as it needed to be. More, and when Vela overcommitted on a thrust aimed at his ribs, he sidestepped and brought the flat of the blade around in a short chopping arc that caught her across the midsection and launched her off her feet. She hit the sand 5 meters away and did not get up for 10 seconds, and when she did, she raised her hand in surrender without speaking. His third match was against a Gorvan champion named Dearth, who stood 8 feet tall and weighed over 500 pounds with bone armor so thick that most blades could not even scratch it. And the crowd expected this to be the match where the human finally met his limit, because the Gorvan were the tanks of the galaxy, and even Thyari blade masters struggled against their natural defenses. Dirth charged like a freight train, lowering his armored head and driving forward with enough force to crush a wall. And Kale planted his feet and swung the tungsten blade in a flat horizontal arc that connected with Dirth's shoulder. Plate with a sound like a cannon going off. The bone armor cracked. Dirth staggered sideways, more from surprise than pain, because no blade had ever cracked his armor before. And before he could recover, Kale swung again, a rising diagonal cut that caught the Gorvan across the chest and sent him stumbling backward toward the edge of the platform. The third swing was the one that ended it, a full overhead strike with both hands on the grip and all of Kale's weight behind it. And when the flat of the blade connected with Dirth's armored torso, the Gorvan was lifted off his feet. Actually lifted, 500 pounds of bone and muscle launched off the sparring platform entirely to land in the sand below with a crash that shook the arena floor. Dirth did not get up, not because he was unconscious, but because he was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened to him. Match after match, day after day, Kale cut through the bracket with a brutal efficiency that left the Academy speechless. And the pattern was always the same. He would stand with the blade on his shoulder and wait for his opponent to come to him, and then he would end it in 1 or 2 or at most 3 moves. Never more, never less than necessary. He never shouted, and he never celebrated, and he never taunted, and he never showed any emotion at all. And that was somehow more frightening than if he had been screaming, because it meant that none of this was hard for him. None of this was even interesting. He was just doing a job the way a machine does a job, with complete efficiency and zero wasted energy. Silith watched every single match from the officer's observation deck, and the laughter that she had felt on the first day was so far gone now that she could barely remember what it had felt like. She spent her evenings researching, not Kale specifically, because his file was still mostly redacted, but Earth and humanity in general, and what she found disturbed her in ways she had not expected. Humans did not just fight with strength or speed or instinct the way most species did. They fought with something they called doctrine, which was a system of organized knowledge about killing that they had been developing and refining for thousands and thousands of years, passed down from generation to generation, and tested in countless wars against each other. They had books about it, entire libraries dedicated to the science of combat, and they studied it the way Thiari studied art or Prelian studied mathematics, with rigor and discipline and an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on madness. Kale's movements in the ring were not natural talent, Silith realized. They were the product of that doctrine, every step and every swing and every shift of weight, calculated according to principles that had been refined through more wars than any other species in the Concord had ever. And then she found the file on Kepler 442b. It was a colony world, or it had been, a planet with rich minerals and thick forests, and a gravity of 3.1 times Earth standard. Humanity had tried to settle it 15 years ago, with a population of 400 colonists. Something had gone wrong. The details were classified, but the outcome was not. The colony had been declared lost after contact was severed, and a rescue mission sent 2 years later had found one survivor, a colonial marine sergeant who had been living alone on the surface for 14 months, surrounded by the bones of predators that the xenobiologists could not identify, because nothing in the Concord's database matched them. The sergeant's name was Kale Morrow. Silith closed her terminal and sat in silence for a long time, and when the semi-final bracket was posted the next morning, and she saw her own name listed as Kale's next opponent, felt, since she was a young cadet stepping into the ring for the very first time, she felt afraid. Not of losing, although that was part of it, but of something bigger and harder to name. The growing suspicion that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake by laughing at this species, by dismissing them as small and soft and harmless, because everything she had seen in the last 2 weeks told her that humans were none of those things. They were something else entirely, and the galaxy was only just beginning to find out what. The night before the semi-final match, the Academy was buzzing with a kind of nervous energy that Silith had never felt in all her years as an instructor, and she could hear cadets in the halls talking in hushed voices about what was going to happen when the Thyari's greatest living blade master faced the impossible human, and most of them were not sure who they wanted to win anymore. She could not sleep. She tried meditation, and she tried reviewing combat forms, and she tried reading intelligence reports, but none of it worked, because her mind kept circling back to the same question over and over, a question that had nothing to do with strategy or technique. Who was Kale Morrow, really? At some point past midnight, she gave up trying to sleep and left her quarters, walking through the empty corridors of the Academy with no destination in mind, just moving because stillness had become unbearable, and she eventually found herself on the observation deck that overlooked the valley below the mountain, a wide-open balcony with a curved railing and a view of the stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. Kale was already there. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the railing and his legs stretched out in front of him, and he was looking up at the sky with an expression that Silith had never seen on his face before, something softer and more distant than the blank mask he wore in the arena, something that looked almost like loneliness. She almost turned around and left, but he spoke before she could. "You can sit if you want," he said without looking at her. "The view is the same from every angle." Silith hesitated for a moment, and then crossed the deck and sat down against the railing, a few feet away from him, folding her long, scaled legs beneath her, the way Thyari did when they wanted to appear less threatening. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all. The stars above Veltharis Prime were different from the stars above Earth. Kale had told himself that enough times that he almost believed it mattered, but the truth was that stars were stars, and the space between them was the same cold, empty black, no matter where you were standing. "I reviewed your file," Silith said finally, and her voice was different than it had been in the arena, quieter and without the sharp commanding edge, just a person talking to another person in the dark, or what little of it I could access. "Not much to see," Kale said. "Kepler 442b, she said, and she watched his face when she said it, and saw the way his jaw tightened just slightly, a tiny crack in the mask that closed again almost immediately. 14 months alone on a world that should have killed you." "It tried," Kale said. "What happened there?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Silith thought he was not going to answer, and then he let out a breath that sounded like it had been held inside him for years. 400 people landed on that planet thinking they could build a life there, and something in the forests disagreed. I do not know what they were, because nobody ever got close enough to study them and live. They came at night, and they were fast, and they had too many legs and too many teeth, and they did not stop. He paused and looked at his hands the way a person looks at tools that have done terrible work. The colony lasted 3 months, and then it was just me, and I lasted 14 more because I am very hard to kill, and because I learned that the things in the forest were afraid of fire, but not afraid of anything else. So I burned a lot of that forest down, and when I ran out of things to burn, I used rocks, and I used sticks, and I used my hands. Silith stared at him and tried to imagine what that must have been like. Alone on a world with 3 times Earth's gravity, surrounded by creatures that had slaughtered 400 people, surviving day after day after day, with nothing but fire and desperation and the sheer biological stubbornness of a species that refused to die. Normal gravity, but for me it is a stick. It has no weight and no presence, and I cannot feel where it is in space. The tungsten blade is the first thing since I left that planet that feels real in my hands. Silith absorbed this in silence, and something shifted inside her, a realignment of understanding that was almost physical, like a bone being set back into its proper place after being broken. She had laughed at him on the first day because she saw a small, soft alien asking a foolish question, but he was not small, and he was not soft, and the question was not foolish. He was a survivor of something that most warriors in the Concord could not have endured for a single day, and the weight he carried had nothing to do with the sword. "I underestimated you," she said, and it cost her something to say it. Pride, maybe, or the comfortable certainty that her species was superior. "I will not make that mistake tomorrow." "Good," Kale said, and for the first time, Silith thought she saw the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I would rather fight you at your best." The semi-final match began at noon the next day, and the arena was so full that cadets were standing in the aisles, and sitting on the steps, and hanging over the railings of the upper decks, and the broadcast feed was being transmitted to every world in the Concord, because word had spread far beyond the Academy now. The human had become a story, and stories traveled fast. Silith entered from the east gate, wearing traditional Fyari fighting attire, a fitted suit of dark green that left her arms and legs free to move, and she carried twin crystal steel sabers that had been in her family for 4 generations, each one perfectly balanced and honed to an edge that could split a hair lengthwise. She was magnificent. 7 feet of scaled power, moving with a grace that made the very air seem to part respectfully around her. And the Thyari cadets in the crowd rose to their feet and roared their approval. Kale entered from the west gate, carrying the tungsten blade on his shoulder, wearing the same simple gray uniform he had worn every day since he arrived. And the human contingent in the crowd cheered for him, but there was only one human in the building, so the cheering was rather quiet. The starting tone sounded, and Silith attacked immediately, because she had watched every one of Kale's matches, and she knew that his strategy was to wait and counter. So she refused to give him time to settle, closing the distance in a blur of green scales and flashing steel. She was faster than anyone Kale had faced in the trials, her twin sabers creating overlapping arcs of crystal steel that came from angles he had not encountered before. And within the first 10 seconds, she had scored 3 cuts on his arms and 1 across his ribs, thin red lines that welled with blood on his pale skin. Kale did not flinch. He swung the tungsten blade, and Silith ducked under it with a flexibility that seemed impossible for someone her size. And then she was inside his guard, and her sabers were flashing, and he took 2 more cuts across his shoulders before he could reset. This was the difference between Silith and every other opponent. She was not just fast and not just skilled, she was intelligent, reading his movements and adapting in real time, never attacking from the same angle twice, never giving him the clean single exchange that his fighting style was built around. The bout passed 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes, and the crowd had gone from cheering to simply watching in stunned silence, because they had never seen anything like this. 2 fighters at the absolute peak of their abilities, locked in a contest that neither one could finish. Silith scored dozens of cuts, small ones, precise ones, the death of 1,000 paper cut strategy that she used against opponents she could not overpower. And Kale bled from his arms and his ribs and his shoulders and his legs and 1 cut above his left eye that swelled shut within minutes, half blinding him. But he did not slow down. His human biology was doing what human biology had been doing for millions of years, flooding his system with adrenaline and endorphins and clotting agents, closing wounds and suppressing pain, and feeding his muscles with oxygen and glucose at a rate that the Concord scientists had called anomalous. And he kept swinging the tungsten blade with the same force and the same precision he had shown in the first second of the fight. 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 35 minutes, Silith was breathing hard. In all her years of fighting, she had never breathed hard, not once, because Thyari were among the most efficient warriors in the galaxy, and their stamina was legendary. But this human was still standing, and still swinging, and still bleeding. A sound, and the effort of dodging that impossible blade over and over and over, was beginning to take its toll. At 41 minutes, Kale caught both of her sabers in a bind against the flat of his blade, trapping them in a V of tungsten carbide, and then he pushed. It was not a fast movement. It was slow and grinding and utterly unstoppable, like a glacier moving through a valley. And Silith braced with everything she had, all 7 feet and 300 pounds of Thyari muscle pushing back against a force that should not have been coming from a creature half her size. Her knees buckled. She went down to one knee, with both sabers still locked against his blade, and her arms trembling with the effort of holding them there. And she looked up at his face, and saw that his one open eye was looking back at her with something that was not anger and not triumph, but was very clearly and unmistakably respect. He stepped back and released the bind, and the sudden absence of pressure nearly sent her sprawling. And then he did something that made the entire arena gasp. He extended his free hand toward her. "You are the best I have ever fought," he said, and his voice was raw and honest, and there was blood running down his face, and his body was covered in cuts, and he meant every word. "I would rather win when you are fresh." Silith stared at his hand for a long moment, and then she laughed. But this time it was a completely different laugh from the one she had given on the first day. This one was warm and surprised, and full of something that sounded like wonder, because in all her years of fighting, no one had ever offered her that kind of respect in the middle of a match. "You impossible creature," she said, and she took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "I yield." The arena erupted, every species cheering together for the first time anyone could remember, and Silith stood beside Kale, with her hands still in his, and thought that perhaps the galaxy was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than she had ever given it credit for. The final match was announced that evening, and when Silith heard who Kale's opponent would be, the warmth she had felt in the arena turned to ice in her chest. It was not another cadet, and it was not another champion. It was Warden, the Academy's combat AI, an undefeated hard-light training construct that had not lost a single match in 200 years of continuous operation, a machine intelligence designed to test the absolute limits of organic fighters, and it had never been entered into the trials before because it was not considered fair. The Commandant had authorized it personally, with a single note attached to the order that read, "We need to properly assess the human." Silith read the note 3 times, and felt the ice in her chest spread to her stomach, because she knew what properly assess meant in military language. Meant they were afraid of him, and they wanted to know exactly how afraid they should be. The grand arena of Veltharis Prime had not been filled to absolute capacity in 40 years, but on the day of the final match, there was not a single empty seat in the building, and thousands more were watching from screens set up in the courtyards and training halls and mess rooms and barracks, and beyond the academy, the broadcast was being carried live to every inhabited world in the galactic concord. 12 species, hundreds of planets, billions of eyes, all watching one human walk onto a sand-covered fighting floor to face a machine that had never been defeated. Kale entered from the west gate the same way he always did, carrying the tungsten blade on his shoulder, with a steady, unhurried stride. And the crowd was so quiet that you could hear his boots pressing into the sand with each step. And somewhere in the officer's observation deck, Silith Vayan stood with her claws wrapped around the railing, and her golden eyes fixed on the arena floor, with an intensity that made the cadets standing near her take a careful step backward. Warden activated in the center of the ring. It manifested as a column of blue-white light that solidified into a humanoid shape, but not quite human and not quite anything else. A form designed to be optimal rather than familiar, with proportions calculated by 2 centuries of combat data, and a processing speed that made organic thought look like a candle next to a star. The construct stood 7 feet tall, and carried a hard light blade that could change shape and weight and length in real time, and its surface shimmered with a cold, clean light that made it look less like a fighter and more like a force of nature given a body. "Combatant Kale Morrow," Warden said, and its voice was calm and precise and completely without malice. "I have analyzed all 14 of your previous matches. Your reaction times have been cataloged. Your attack patterns have been mapped. Your optimal striking angles have been calculated to within 0.3 degrees of variance. This match will serve as a comprehensive assessment of human combat capability." Kale looked at the machine and said nothing. The starting tone sounded. Warden moved first, and it was so fast that most of the audience did not see it move at all. One moment, it was standing in the center of the ring, and the next, it was directly in front of Kale, with its hard light blade already mid-swing. A perfectly calculated strike, aimed at the exact angle where Kale's reaction time would be slowest, based on 14 matches worth of data. Kale blocked, barely, and the impact drove him backward 3 steps. Warden followed without pause, its blade shifting from a long saber to a short paired combination, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, attacking from angles that exploited every pattern it had recorded. And Kale was suddenly fighting not one opponent, but every opponent he had ever faced, because Warden had absorbed the techniques of 200 years of the galaxy's greatest warriors, and could deploy any of them at any time. The first minute was bad. The second minute was worse. Warden struck Kale across the ribs with a Thyari technique, then shifted to a Gorvon power strike that slammed the tungsten blade aside and opened his guard. Then switched to a Zelkari 4-point pattern, adapted for 2 limbs, that scored 3 hits in under a second, each one precisely calibrated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage, because this was an assessment, not an execution. Though it was starting to look like both. Kale was driven across the arena floor like a ship in a storm, barely blocking, barely dodging, taking hits that would have ended any of his previous matches, and the tungsten blade that had seemed so devastating against organic opponents was too slow to catch a machine that could calculate its trajectory before the swing even started. Watched in grim silence as the human bled. Scylla's claws dug into the metal railing and left deep gouges that would still be there years later. And she wanted to look away, but she could not, because something in her refused to stop watching, something that whispered that this was not over, that this human had survived 14 months on a death world, and a machine with a sword was not going to be the thing that finally broke him. 2 minutes and 37 seconds into the match, Kale was bleeding from 9 separate wounds, and his left arm was hanging at an angle that suggested something was either broken or very close to it, and Warden pressed forward with another combination that drove him to the edge of the platform. And then Kale did something that made Warden pause for 0.4 seconds, which was an eternity in machine processing time. He dropped his blade. 38 kilograms of tungsten carbide fell from his hand and hit the arena floor with a sound like a thunderclap, so heavy and so loud that it echoed off the walls and the ceiling and the stands, and seemed to hang in the air long after the blade had settled into the sand. Every fighter in the arena held their breath. Warden's processing cores cycled through rapid recalculation, because this was not in any of its models. No fighter in 200 years of operation had ever voluntarily disarmed in the middle of a match, and the tactical implications were so far outside the expected parameters that the AI required nearly half a second to generate new predictions. In that half second, Kale rolled his shoulders. He cracked his neck, a sharp popping sound that carried through the silent arena, And then he moved. Without the blade, he was a different thing entirely, faster than Warden's models had predicted by a factor that the machine would later classify as significant deviation from established baseline. Them in a single explosive step that cracked the stone beneath his feet, and he was inside the reach of Warden's blade before the AI could adjust. He hit the construct with his bare fist. The impact registered on Warden's sensors as equivalent to a distrial piston, concentrated into an area the size of a human knuckle, and the hard light form flickered for a microsecond as the projector array struggled to maintain cohesion under the force. Warden adapted, shifting to close-quarters combat protocols. But Kale was not fighting like a swordsman anymore. He was not fighting like any kind of trained warrior that existed in the machine's database. He was fighting the way he had fought on Kepler 442b, with the raw, desperate, creative violence of a man who had once killed things that had too many legs and too many teeth, using rocks and sticks and his bare hands in gravity that would have crushed most species flat. He used the environment, grabbing fistfuls of sand and hurling them at Warden's optical sensors, kicking the fallen tungsten blade across the floor to trip the construct's footwork algorithms, using the arena walls as springboards to attack from angles that no tactical model had ever accounted for, because no sane fighter would ever attempt them. He took hits that should have stopped him, a strike across the back that opened a wound from shoulder to hip, a kick to the knee that made something pop in a way that knees were not supposed to pop, a slash across the chest that painted the sand red beneath his feet. He did not stop. He did not slow. He fought with his fists and his elbows and his knees and his forehead and his teeth, and every time Warden knocked him down, he got back up, not quickly and not gracefully, but with an absolute grinding, relentless certainty that made the machine recalculate and the crowd rise to their feet. This was what humans were, not the strongest and not the fastest. Skilled, but something more fundamental and more terrifying than any of those things. They were the species that did not stop, that could not be convinced to stay down, that took damage that would kill any other creature in the galaxy, and stood back up and kept coming, with blood in their eyes and broken bones grinding together, and a determination that no machine could model, because it was not rational, it was not logical, it was something older and deeper and more powerful than logic. It was the thing that had made them chase prey across the African savanna until the prey collapsed, the thing that had made them cross oceans in wooden boats and climb mountains that killed them and go to war against each other over and over and survive every single time, the thing that lived in their bones and their blood and their stubborn, impossible hearts. The crowd was on its feet. Every species, the Thyri and the Gorvan and the Zelkari and the Prelians and all the rest, standing, roaring, and some of them weeping, because they had never seen anything like this, and they knew they never would again. Kale caught Warden's hard-light arm in both hands and held it. The construct pulled back with a force calculated to exceed any organic grip strength in its database. But Kale's hands did not open. His fingers were locked like iron vices powered by adrenaline and desperation, and 14 months of gripping things that were trying to kill him in 3 times Earth's gravity. And he held on with everything he had left. Warden's free hand came around for a killing strike, and Kale leaned back just enough to let it pass over his face. And then he surged forward with the last of his strength, and drove his forehead into the center of Warden's chest, where the primary projector node was housed. The headbutt connected with a crack that sounded like the world breaking in half. The projector array shattered. Warden's hard-light form flickered, stuttered, destabilized, and collapsed into a shower of blue-white sparks that rained down on the sand like dying stars, and the arena was suddenly empty except for one human standing in the center of the ring, swaying on his feet, covered in blood and sand and broken light, with his fists still clenched and his one good eye still open and his heart still beating. The silence lasted for exactly 2 seconds. Then the grand arena of Veltharus Prime erupted with a sound that shook the mountain to its foundations. 10,000 voices from 12 species, screaming and roaring and howling and clicking and hissing their approval in a wall of noise that could be heard in the valley below. And the broadcast carried that sound to every world in the Concord, billions of beings hearing for the first time the sound the galaxy makes when it recognizes something extraordinary. Silith was the first one on the arena floor. She vaulted the railing of the observation deck and dropped 3 stories to the sand, and crossed the distance to Kale in 4 long strides, reaching him just as his knees buckled, and she caught him under the arms and held him upright with a gentleness that no one who knew her would have believed she was capable of. "You dropped your sword," she said, and her voice was shaking. He grinned through the blood, a real grin this time, wide and human and alive. "Too light," he said. Then he passed out in her arms, and she held him there in the center of the arena, while the galaxy roared around them. And she was laughing again, laughing with tears running down her scaled face. Not the cold, contemptuous laugh from the first day, but a laugh full of joy and wonder, and the overwhelming realization that the universe was so much bigger and stranger and more magnificent than she had ever dared to imagine. The aftermath came quickly. The Galactic Concord formally reclassified humanity from Tier 6, designated non-threat, to designated strategic concern, making them the fastest species in recorded history to jump 4 classification levels. And military analysts across 12 species began revising their threat assessments and defensive doctrines with an urgency that bordered on panic. The Academy added a new mandatory module to its curriculum, titled Human Combat Doctrine, and Silith Thayan personally volunteered to teach it, which surprised everyone except Kale, who was not surprised because he was still unconscious in the medical ward, growing new skin, and waiting for his bones to finish healing themselves, which they did, stronger than before, because that is what human bones do. And somewhere in the Academy's quartermaster office, Old Duck sat at his desk, staring at a new weapons requisition form that had arrived from Earth's military attaché, stamped and authorized and completely serious, requesting a full production run of training blades for the next generation of human cadets to be admitted to the Academy. Minimum weight per blade, 50 kilograms. Duke read the number, set the form down, looked up at the ceiling with all 4 of his cloudy old eyes, and said the only thing that seemed appropriate. "Ancestors preserve us all." And far away across the stars, on a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow sun, the species that the galaxy had laughed at continued to do what it had always done. It got back up, and it kept going.